Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today in this policy dialogue organized by the European Policy Center to discuss how the transatlantic relationship can help address regional challenges in the Western Balkans. This policy dialogue is part of a Transatlantic Challenges event series that the EPC organizes in cooperation with the US mission to the EU. Now, the EU and the US have a long-standing history of engagement in the Western Balkans, dating back to the end of the Yugoslavian wars. Both have a vested interest in ensuring regional stability and promoting the rule of law and democratic consolidation. However, more than 20 years later, regional stability and the full Euro-Atlantic integration of the region still remains elusive, with many unresolved tensions still dominating headlines and debate in the Western Balkans and beyond. From ethnic tensions to divisive rhetoric, to bilateral disputes, to slow progress on carrying out the necessary reforms to consolidate democracy. And also, Russia's war against Ukraine has sort of changed the landscape and the political landscape in the wider context, but in the region as well, exacerbating existing security concerns and also adding renewed urgency to promote positive change in the region. So it's in this context that we are discussing this issue today, and that we hope to assess the legacy of both the US and the EU engagement in the region, but also look ahead at what can be improved and what the transatlantic community's most urgent priorities should be in the region, especially in this new context of the Zeitenwende and Russia's aggression of Ukraine. Now, to discuss these issues with us, we have three outstanding speakers that have agreed to join this debate, and I'm very, very happy, delighted, and honored to introduce to you Nikola Dimitrov, non-resident fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences and former foreign minister of North Macedonia, Gordana Delić, director of the Balkans Trust for Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and Jamie Fly, president and CEO of Radio Free Europe. My name is Marta Mucznik, and I'm a policy analyst at the European Politics and Institutions program of the EPC. Welcome again, welcome you all, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak at this event. Now, just a few housekeeping rules. I will first, to our audience who's listening in, I will first have a conversation with our panelists, and then I will turn to the audience for a Q&A. You can pose your question in writing in the Q&A section of your screen, or just raise your hand in the lower bottom of your screen as well in the little icon with the hand, and I will give you the floor directly. I will ask you to please pose very concrete questions so that I'm able to go through all of them properly. Otherwise, as I said, just please feel free to raise your hand and I'll give you the floor directly. And I will first start with the first question addressed to all speakers. And that is related to what I've mentioned before, that we all know that the US and the EU have a long history of engagement in the region that has evolved over the past decades, but there has been a significant game changer in the past year in the wider context with Russia's aggression of Ukraine, which also affects political developments in the Western Balkans. And in your point of view, what priorities should the transatlantic relationship focus on in the region right now? And how, in your view, has this new context really affected developments in the countries? And also, are you optimistic that, that there is a renewed momentum to accelerate the Euro-Atlantic integration of the region? So I will first give the floor to Jamie, and then follow, and then I will give the floor to Gordana and Nikola. So please, Jamie, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks Marta, and thanks to EPC for organizing this conversation. So I feel like I'm kind of the odd man out here. I do not consider myself an expert on the Balkans, but I'm coming to this topic based on Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's work in the region. So I'm going to mostly talk about independent media and kind of our reflections on what we see across the Western Balkans. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, I should just note up front, we're funded by the US Congress, but we're editorially independent of the US government. And we operate in 23 countries and provide content in 27 languages across Eurasia. And we have a significant presence in the Western Balkans, and our Balkans service, operating in multiple languages, does amazing work on the ground. So when I look at the region, kind of setting aside for a minute the whole question of US and EU engagement, I see significant challenges like those that we see across our entire coverage region. We see media landscapes that are flooded by disinformation, conspiracy theories. We have weak or non-existent public media, which is why we try to be there in those markets to fill that space. We have oligarch-linked media. We have maligned foreign-linked and politicized media backed by Russia, China, other malign actors who are all trying to influence the populations in these countries and ultimately to affect the future of the region. So we respond to that first by just being there, by being active on the ground. We have 5 bureaus across the region. And what we're trying to do is provide reporting and information that people cannot get from other sources, given how compromised a lot of those information sources are. So we focus on things like investigative reporting to help root out corruption. We're doing increased reporting on China's growing influence in the region. We've always covered Russia's malign influence across the Western Balkans, but then also doing a lot of local journalism, covering topics that people feel connect to their day-to-day lives, that they can take that reporting and use it to impact how they live their lives, the well-being of their families. Those are the sorts of reporting projects that we are doing. You asked in part about how the last year has changed things. I think for us, it hasn't changed a whole lot, in the sense that we've always provided reporting about what's going on in the region. We have increased our reporting about the war in Ukraine using our significant presence on the ground in Ukraine. But I think we have been concerned by what we see about how much Russian propaganda about the war, about the Zelensky government, continues to permeate in many of the media markets in the Western Balkans. And I think it's just a reminder of some of those broader aspects of the environment that I talked about first, that these are information landscapes that are highly compromised and corrupted. So I think I'd end my initial statement by touching on what the US and EU can do. Certainly there needs to be more focus on this region. I think in general, this unfortunately has been a region that the transatlantic community has talked a lot about across multiple presidential administrations in the US, multiple governments inside the EU, but we haven't seen a lot of progress in terms of high-level sustained attention to deal with some of the ongoing political challenges and to really make clear to publics in these countries that there is a clear transatlantic path. When I talk to my staff in our 5 bureaus, that is the common thing I hear across national boundaries, is the uncertainty about whether their country has a home in the transatlantic community in the future. And so I think that's kind of the meta issue that needs to be resolved between Washington and Brussels. And then on the independent media space, we're very supportive of more US and EU engagement with governments to try to develop and get those governments to adhere to standards, to push back when journalists are threatened, and to provide support for independent media. We can play our role as an international public media outlet, but there's still a lot of need for enhanced donor assistance to small independent media outlets across the region. And I think that's incredibly important to try to push back against a lot of the malign influence we see in the information space, to put these countries on a path towards eventually EU accession and a permanent home in the transatlantic community. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Jamie. Indeed, that's very important, and I was hoping to delve into these discussions on also public opinion in the various countries and also in the media freedom in these countries at perhaps a later stage. But for now, Gordana, if you could also comment on what do you think the most urgent priorities for transatlantic relationship are. And if you would like to react to also some of Jamie's comments, please feel free.
Thank you very much. And thank you, EPC, for doing this. Let me just introduce that I work for the Balkan Trust for Democracy, which is the German Marshall Fund of the United States project for the whole of the Balkans region, with a focus on the Western Balkans 6. I couldn't but do anything else but completely agree with Jamie. It is clear that internal lack of reforms and internal problems of the countries in the Balkans are also topped with the how should I say, the inability of the EU to deal with the region appropriately in the past decade. Now, what has changed was your question with Ukraine, with this brutal war on Ukraine. What has changed is the fact that the transatlantic community actually realized that to secure its entire eastern flank from north to south is a must, actually. And that has created a certain momentum, maybe in this region as well. But the key question is what Jamie has also pointed out to, how sustainable it is, and for how much longer will this momentum last? Not just on behalf of the EU and the whole of the transatlantic community, but also in the countries in the Balkans. So I would say that it's also about time to start looking at the region from a broader perspective, rather from the perspective of the Southeast Europe than from the perspective of purely Western Balkans. And I'm saying this because the malign influence that Jamie has mentioned is basically approaching the region from this perspective. The Chinese investments, so-called investments, are not looking at the Western Balkans. They are approaching this region from a broader perspective, and that's from the perspective of the Southeast Europe. Russia, likewise. So I would say, if we really want to fight this and secure the entire eastern flank of the transatlantic community, then we need some adjustment in how we approach things. So that would be the first thing. I applaud to the developments of making the EU accession process more political than it has been thus far. I think we have seen a decade of purely technical dealing with the EU accession process. I must say I was never a fan of that. I do understand that certain things must be technical, such as seeing whether reforms are being in place and the implementation of those reforms and so on. But nevertheless, the EU accession process is actually a highly political process, and that should never get lost. It should never be out of the equation. Now, what needs to be done and what are the priorities? I think that is pretty clear. The energy diversification for this region is a must. The alignment with the EU and the transatlantic community's foreign policy is a must. And I think, slowly it will be going in that way. What bothers me is, and I really do not want to sound harsh here, but we have two NATO member states in the region whose internal instability was partly triggered by the inability of the EU to address certain challenges and to actually give those countries a better or clearer vision of their possible future in the European Union. And namely, when we have a representative from one of those countries, it is North Macedonia. So I do think that the European Union should work faster, which does not mean with less quality, but should work faster on eliminating certain things that are in the way, especially when it comes to the NATO member states in the region. Of course, accession is a two-way street. So the homework for the countries remains. Reforms align, as I said, with the EU foreign policy, and above all, the rule of law is what is not in the best state in the countries. And then, and I'll finish with this, but there are two issues that are keeping parts or the whole region hostage. One is the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, and the other one is the, paralyzed Bosnia and Herzegovina. These two have been resolved in the 90s via one Dayton Peace Accords, and the second one was the Resolution 1244. I think it is important not to forget that both were multilateral agreements that made peace. And in this respect, I think it is important to understand that the resolution of these two, in order for the region to move forward, will also have to be, a multilateral. I'm sorry, I meant multilateral, said bilaterals earlier. So it will require the involvement of both the EU and the US, also of the region, to find solutions for the region to move forward with these. And let me finish by saying, I think the timeline is something that has to be developed, region together with the EU and the US, in how to move forward. And I think this timeline and the order of things will be very important, because certain things should not be, superseding the others. And the other thing is, I am really glad that the US leadership is back when it comes to this region, and that things actually have started moving in certain directions, in good directions, with the US leadership in the region. And I can finish here for the beginning.
Thank you, Gordana. Nikola, do you agree that the US leadership is back in the region? And what's your perspective from sitting from North Macedonia? And also, what do you think that where should the transatlantic relationship focus on? What are the most urgent priorities from your perspective in North Macedonia?
Yes. So maybe initially, first of all, thanks to you, Marta, and EPC for putting us together and organizing this important exchange today. I also want to thank Jamie and the whole team of Radio Free Europe. They're doing a great job. I can confirm that, and I very much underscore his recommendations on what our friends and partners from the transatlantic community can do to help the media landscape in the region. We need our citizens informed to have a healthy democracy in all of our countries, and we need this sector quite vibrant. We are not, talking about that, it's interesting that the last report of the Reporters Beyond Borders placed many of the countries in the region, when it comes to freedom of the media, in a better situation than some of our neighbors who are already in the EU, which is something that I'd like to point out. Often fighting the stigma that we in the Balkans are somehow inherently less capable than others. We are actually capable of turning this around and moving forward. The big picture is that when we want peace in the region, this was done with a heavy US engagement in the mid-90s, then again around the Kosovo story, and afterwards the plan was that the region becomes stable and moves towards functional and vibrant democracies with improving economies, having the EU in the driver's seat. All countries reform, we all become closer and closer to membership, borders become less important, and one day we join. This was the game plan. Now, this didn't work to a large extent because of the EU itself. I'm not a fan of EU bashing. Sometimes it was one country, it's a difficult decision-making of the Union. Sometimes it was another country, but the result was that we have a process that has dragged on for too long. The European future of the region was politically promised even though also back in 2000 in the Zagreb summit. It was the big Thessaloniki summit 2003. It's been 2 decades. And the only big progress, success that we have achieved is Croatia joining the EU in 2013. Now, at the moment, this process that started as a stairway to heaven, let's use a title of a rock song I like, is now more towards a road to nowhere. We have member states who are not really trusting that the process is making a difference in terms of democratic and rule of law reforms. And we have candidate countries that do not trust that the EU is serious when it talks about European perspective and that one day we will be part of the European family. Now, the war in Ukraine, because we have war on the continent, and it is always wise when your values are attacked, your vision is attacked, to consolidate. Ukraine also applied and got candidate status. Pretty much the fight is about Ukrainians being free to decide about their own future, and they want a European future. So this is also has consequences on our region. There is a momentum, there is a potential for change, but so far we still have not seen significant political visions or decisions to make this reality. So we are still at the level of debates and discussing ideas. But this is how it starts. I think we need to push to have, what do we need? We need a credible political game plan for our region. Some member states say enlargement is critically important, but for us to accept new members, we have to reform on the inside. We need to change the way we make decisions, move from consensus to qualified majority. If this is the case, and this is a debate that is difficult and not fully predictable, then in the meantime, we need a meaningful goal for the region, be it membership without vetoes and commissioners or access to single market. We need a time frame because it's been for so long. 20 years have passed. My own country has been a candidate country for 17 years. And we are still sort of starting accession talks. We have started, but it's only a half. We are the only country in the history of enlargement that needs 2 IGCs to complete the opening phase of the accession talks because of the issues we have with Bulgaria. So we need a meaningful goal, not an alternative, but let's say an interim stop towards joining. We need a time frame. We need a consensus. I think this should be realistic. And we need a more flexible process. We need more funds because the economic gap between the region and the member states around us is increasing. It's a ratio of 1 to 10. What a per capita European contribution is for Greece, Bulgaria, Croatia, or Romania, or for the countries, the 6 countries of the Western Balkans. From 500 euros in the 7 years financial cycle to 6,000 per capita for the member states. We need for countries who perform a seat around the table, those who have fully aligned on the Eastern Mediterranean, on the sanctions against Russia. Why shouldn't they be in the room when foreign ministers deliberate the war? Without voting, of course, without voting rights, but we should be seen and treated as future member states. All of the problems in the region, the Pristina-Belgrade dialogue, the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the rule of law and the democratic reforms that the people need. Everything will be easier if in the background we have a credible political context of the region moving towards the EU. You take the European dream out of the equation, everything becomes much more difficult. I think there is a full alignment between the US interest in the Balkans and the European Union interest in the Balkans. And I think we have to make use of that. But the failing element, ingredient, is this credible political game plan for the Western Balkans. We deserve this, and it is also in the EU's selfish interest even to have this region in terms of pan-European planning, in terms of migration, in terms of security, in terms of closing down the vacuum or taking the region out of this limbo where other foreign actors see a potential for a geopolitical competition. So, and finally, and I'm ending with this, if the EU cannot make a difference in this region, which is encircled by member states, which is not really a challenge, looking at our size, our population, etc., our political vision, which is aligned with that of the EU, then EU will most certainly fail globally if it has an ambition to have a geopolitical voice. And we are already seeing, there was a very interesting editorial in the Financial Times yesterday on the gap between the expectations of Ukraine when it comes to their European future and what is possible in reality. The Prime Minister of Ukraine said publicly that they hope to be able to join in 2 years. President Macron, some months ago, referred to it as a decades-long process. It could take maybe 3 decades or more. So if we use a copy-paste of this story from our region to Ukraine, we are in for huge frustrations and disappointments. Thanks.
Thank you, Nikola, and I agree that we really need renewed commitment to take the region out of this limbo, and that it's very important to have a credible perspective and a time frame. What have been the U.S. efforts in this regard? I mean, US-EU coordination. How does the U.S., in your view and in your experience in North Macedonia, also, I mean, what has been the conversation regarding this issue, and what can the US and the transatlantic community do together to also help accelerate North Macedonia's EU's perspective?
So just to set my credentials clear for the virtual audience, I am a former ambassador of then Macedonia, today North Macedonia, to Washington. And I was the national NATO coordinator. I signed the Vilnius statement. So for 25 years, I've been working for my country to join NATO and join the European Union. So that said, I think when there is praise, we need to praise. When there is a failure, we need to criticize. And we do this between friends. The US has been extremely helpful to European efforts. The perception of the US in the region is US is a doer. There is a goal, there is a context, they engage, and often they make things happen. So on NATO, which was tied to us overcoming the name dispute with Greece, which happened with the Prespa agreement, this was a homemade agreement, but there was support for both countries in Washington, and there was a big support to make sure that the ratification process afterwards, once this was done, is smooth. So finally we joined NATO. US is very present in the region, helping to, for instance, recently take down the barriers in the north of in North Kosovo, in the context of this recent escalation between the two countries. But the US cannot do EU's job when it comes to reinvigorating the enlargement policy. Actually, some member states are not happy when the US is calling them to say, get a bit more serious, please, with this. Sometimes it backfires. So we Europeans will have to do this. It is for our future. It is for our sake. We have the support of American friends on this. There is a full support for the enlargement process, the EU enlargement process. There is a full support of the EU-led Pristina-Belgrade dialogue. There is a full support for the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And now my last point, because I promised some criticism. In geopolitical times, instinctively governments and leaders and diplomats are sort of pushed to solve problems quickly. Now, there is a danger of falling for this temptation of declaring a quick success, but not solving the problem fully. And I think this is what happened with us and our obstacle with Bulgaria. We have issues of identity and history incorporated with the Copenhagen criteria in our negotiating framework. So whether we move forward will not only be about whether we fight corruption and how free our media are, but also to what extent we agree with the Bulgarian historical narrative. There is a challenge on the Macedonian language, which is not a very European thing to do or a civilized thing to do. Actually, you can make parallels with the Putin narrative on Ukrainians, fake language, a mistake of history, creation of Lenin, we are a creation of... So I think we need to resist this temptation for quick successes and think things through so that when there is a solution, it really solves the problem. And I think this is also applicable to some of the ideas now about around Kosovo. So and also this temptation leads to overlooking deficiencies on the fundamentals. Let's say a leader deliver on something that is politically important for us, but we cannot forgive her or him for democratic backsliding. Because at the end of the day, what really helps is becoming like the vibrant European democracies governed by the rule of law. Not the moment of joining, but the process of transformation. And I think here we also will benefit if we have a commissioner for enlargement who will be more focused on transformation.
Thank you, Nikola. And since to stay a little bit on topic, I wonder, and I'll go back to you, Jamie. But first, Gordana, if you can, turning specifically to the Serbia-Kosovo dispute and following up what has been said. I mean, do you agree with this, with Nikola's outlook on this and on the US's role in the region and solving these bilateral disputes? And what do you think the EU and the US could do to advance normalization? I mean, do you see some renewed activism on the part of the West to solve this issue? And not only from the EU, but also the US. I mean, for example, is there US support for this most recent Franco-German proposal of a normalization agreement? And do US and EU strategies differ, and how so from your experience?
Thank you. Let me start from the back. Yes, US and the EU strategies do differ. I think US has always been much more involved in talking to the actual, people on the ground rather than the EU. The Franco-German proposal was backed up by That's at least what is being said by the entire EU, including the member states who are non-recognizers of Kosovo. So there must be something good about it. What I didn't like about it was that it was so secretive. On the other hand, I don't think that even with this Franco-German proposal, nothing would have happened had US not been much more involved and backed it up and started the dialogue. Now, if you ask me, none of the proposals thus far has been perfect, and I don't think we are to expect ever in the future a perfect proposal for the solution between Kosovo and Serbia. So everybody will have to be at some kind of loss and at some kind of gain there, that's for sure. But I do think it is very important that the dialogue is as intensive as possible. And I do really think it is important that things that are being agreed that have to be done are done. So right now, what has been decided is that, the Association of Serbian Municipalities seems to be a must for Kosovo to put together. And then we can proceed to the next step, whatever that next step might be. And this is what I also meant when I said that the timeline is crucial, especially when we talk about the bilateral disputes in the region still present. They have there has to be a certain number of steps, and those steps have to be followed in a particular order for it to be done in a way that everyone believes it's actually happening, and that is very important. So, I don't think that in the near future, anything would move in this region in the right direction, be there no US involvement. So, yeah, I don't know what to say. I wish, I could say that the EU was more agile in doing this, but I do understand that also, EU has had many of its own internal problems, and with the war in Ukraine, it all just escalated even more so. However, I'd really say that it's about time to finish the project of the EU whole and free, and that includes this part of the world as well.
Thank you, Gordana. Nikola, I see that you have your hand raised. I'll give you the floor before I move on to Jamie.
Very brief, but I think I didn't raise something very important exactly in this context. The US has been quite vocal in the last months, but also supporting that with actions on the most important cause, I think, for all of us, which is fighting corruption. And I was recently in Washington. The special representative for the region, Escobar, said publicly that corruption is the primary problem of the region. And you can, of course, dwell on that, and essentially weak institutions where corruption is rampant. This is a theater that is not too difficult to penetrate, also when it comes to foreign actors and malign influence, etc. So US essentially announced that they will start using their own processes for sanctions, as pointing the finger to corrupt politicians, among others. And I think this is something, of course, fight against corruption is our task, and we will win that fight. The people of the region, the countries of the region are, but this is helpful. So I think the EU could perhaps also follow this example and be a bit more vocal and more courageous when it comes to, pointing out to those who are part of the problem. This will help our societies.
Thank you. Jamie, I wonder what you think of this discussion and also this Nikola's statement that the EU should also focus on maybe fighting corruption with the same tools and instruments as the US. And I also wonder if you could just speak a little bit about the role of the US over the years and US foreign policy and the US's approach over the years. I mean, there is the perception there has been some gradual disengagement over the decades, perhaps leaving that role for the EU to fill, as we've discussed. How much do the Western Balkans, in your point of view, still feature as a priority for US foreign policy?
Sure. I found myself nodding quite a bit when Nikola was talking about the importance of the EU asserting itself. I mean, I think stepping back a bit, the reality is the US is not going to have, especially at senior levels, the policymaker bandwidth to focus on this region the way it did 10 or 20 years ago. And I think that's part of the disengagement you've seen, although I will note, I mean, you mentioned the US being back. Well, some would argue the Trump administration was actually much more engaged at a much higher level in some of the efforts in this region. You can argue whether it was the right way, whether it was counterproductive, but it wasn't so long ago that we did see a US administration involved even at the presidential level trying to help resolve some of these conflicts. And again, you can have your own views about whether it was the right approach or the wrong approach. But I do think that's an aberration. I think the reality that all of us face who cover all of Eurasia, who work on a wide range of issues, you know, the war has dragged people in a different direction, but even setting aside Ukraine, events in Belarus in recent years, the whole Eastern Partnership agenda, there are many other places where policymaker attention has been focused, and the sense is even that resources should be shifted to some of those locations. And I think that has all hurt the agenda in the Western Balkans. And so that's just a structural problem. For Washington, though, the other challenge is going to be the pivot even more to East Asia. And that's where I think it will leave even more of a void that the EU will need to fill. Now, that doesn't mean the US is going to disengage entirely, but I do think that there's a sense that, picking up on what Nikola noted, that the EU really has most of the carrots here. I think the US has a lot of respect and can step in, certainly on security issues, and be relevant to the conversation. But at the end of the day, those populations in the Western Balkans they're looking for EU membership and all of the benefits that come with it. And for that to get resolved, that's not a decision that can be made in Washington. There are fundamental questions that have to be first made in member state capitals and in Brussels about what the future is for the EU, what the EU looks like. Nikola even mentioned some of the backsliding in existing EU member states. I think that's a key point here. RFERL has just returned in recent years to Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary because of concerns about media freedom, because of concerns about rule of law and backsliding. And so you have an EU that doesn't even really have consensus about how to tackle those issues with existing member states, let alone thinking through what standards you hold candidate countries to. And that also relates to Nikola's point about how quick Ukrainian accession happens, because there's a significant strategic case to bring Ukraine in as quickly as possible. But for any of us who have spent any time in Ukraine and know about the situation with rule of law, with media, with corruption, even under Zelensky, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And so those are questions that ultimately the EU will have to decide, and the US can kind of be on the sidelines, giving advice, helping push in the right direction at the right moment. But ultimately, those are, quite frankly, existential questions for the EU. And so a lot of those issues need, I think, to get resolved before we can see progress with a number of the countries in the Western Balkans. And I think that dynamic will only increase in the years ahead, just given the strategic focus on China going forward. The final thing I just, again, pick up on Nikola's point about corruption. A lot of our role, we see our role as independent media in these countries is in large part to help counter the corrupting influence that we see of malign foreign media, which is often backed to financial interests. And so I think we do need a more coherent transatlantic agenda. You can look on at sanctions as part of that, but the sanctions are the tools that you need to deploy when the worst case scenario has played out and corrupt, malign actors are have infiltrated the government, are in control of key institutions. Stepping back from that and proactively trying to counter that influence, I think, is where we really need to focus on institution building, civil society. That's where all of the assistance programs that countries in Europe as well as the United States support are so important. Across all of the countries we operate in, I always see the need for more coordination within the transatlantic community, looking at who we're funding, what works, what institutions have not been successful, comparing notes. So yeah, I think that's a key challenge. But then also just making sure the resources continue to flow. And again, because of the distraction of the war in Ukraine, of other needs like Belarus, supporting Russian civil society, I'm not sure that's a given in the way that it might have been 5 or 10 years ago. And so I think the resourcing of those assistance programs will also be essential in the years ahead.
Thank you. I would like to bring some questions from the audience because I see that there's one, Andre de Munter. You can raise your question now.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you so much for organizing this. I will try and be brief. Hello, everybody. In particular, Nikola, we saw each other recently at an event, and thank you for raising the issue of sanctions and the EU following UK or US sanctions. As it happens, we adopted a resolution in January on the common foreign and security policy, an annual report where we explicitly, and increasingly, we are pushing, as a European Parliament, we are pushing harder. You will find there, again, an explicit call on the other EU institutions to follow the UK and US examples, and Milorad Dodik, for instance, is named in particular. I think it is a good US practice also. I've been preparing the briefing for a mission of the European Parliament next week of our subcommittee, Security and Defense, which will go there. And well, I marked in yellow in my briefing the names of the interlocutors that they will have who are under UK and US sanctions as an extra, I would say, stimulus for our people to take that on board. Thank you very much also for pointing out once again the 17 years that North Macedonia, well, not North Macedonia as such, but let's say Macedonia for the occasion has been in candidate status. I personally think there is quite a lot of hypocrisy around when it comes to Ukraine as well. Remember a couple of years ago, this Juncker Western Balkans strategy where it was said we will no longer import bilateral disputes, you have to solve all of them. The ones that were swept under the carpet were the ones between one or more Western Balkan countries and EU member states, and you are suffering from that now. Look at the opinions of the commissions of the Commission on Moldova and Ukraine, where Donetsk, Luhansk, they are just mentioned, and nobody asked the question. I mean, a future membership of Ukraine with which borders? Which bilateral disputes? But let me please come to my question, which would be more on the specifics and on the transatlantic cooperation. Maybe a question more for Gordana. For instance, there is a clear divergence in attitudes when it comes to support for the High Representative for Bosnia-Herzegovina, Christian Schmidt, who still enjoys clear support from the UK and the US, and in a much more prudent way from the EU with divergences within the EU. And there are, of course, also the influences, clear influences and interests of a couple of member states, Hungary, more related to Republika Srpska, and then Croatia for all the obvious reasons that we know. How would you see that situation evolve, in particular when it comes to the office of the High Representative, and more, I would say, policy alignment between the US and the EU on that? And sorry for being long. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you. Gordana, please.
Oh, thank you very much for your question. Well, you know, it's a $1 million question, basically. You know, if I could answer it, clearly, I think I could easily be awarded some prize. But the fact is that I think both the EU and US have come to a conclusion that certain things that are happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina are much closer on the borderline of actually a capture state rather than a frozen conflict. And as such, they need to act together, right? And I think that the High Representative, at more than one instance, has basically pointed out in that direction. Now, I'm not sure how this is going to evolve. I really don't know, but I would say that what Nikola was mentioning, and we, including our grantees, have been mentioning when it comes to the region as a whole, was for the transatlantic community to follow the money. And is this corruption? Why am I mentioning this is because most of the time, when ethnic tensions reach high, when ethnic tensions are, heightened, there is some corruptive activity as well behind it, because the people who are using, who are doing the organized crime group, so to say, in the region, are using ethnic disagreements, right, as an artifact to basically push their agendas forward. And I think that Bosnia is one of the clear cases, especially with Republika Srpska, where such activities are quite often visible. When it comes to, how will it play out with the High Representative, I honestly don't know. But I would say that for the time being, it is necessary that I think it's a good way of punishing certain groups in the region by doing the sanctions that are tied to a concrete name and last name, rather than punishing entire nations. And I think that's activity that should go forward as well.
Thank you. We have another question from Gudrun. If you would like to raise your question now, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm glad to see Mr. Dimitrov. I'm a former ambassador in Macedonia. I was an ambassador in Macedonia and later on in Montenegro. So I have some insight into the region, and I just attended 2 weeks ago a conference supported by Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland on tackling state capture in Southeast Europe. Also, the American ambassador spoke at the opening of the conference, and actually the picture which came out from the conference is rather bleak. And if Mrs. Delić was just talking about naming and shaming and blaming, we know who the people at the top in Republika Srpska and the Croatian part of the country, which would like to be the Herceg Bosna, are, as well as certain persons, of course, also in Sarajevo. We know who is the president in Montenegro, and we know how the situation in Belgrade is. So corruption is at the very top. And I do not see a really successful approach, neither by the EU nor by the US, to tackle this. And people are extremely frustrated. I have a lot of contact with ordinary people and activists of all kinds, particularly in the field, which is my main issue, nature conservation, resources, protection, environment, in all the countries, the situation is disastrous, but of course, in a country like Bosnia, it has terrible effects. And the country is really also destroyed by so-called investments. The same in Serbia. And where is the approach from the EU or from the US to really tackle this, as it was said in that conference? Sorry, I don't see it. And I don't see really high-ranking persons to be sent to prison. The highest-ranking person was Mr. Sanader. And that was the price Croatia had to pay for the entry into the EU. Or Mr. Marovic in Montenegro, that was the price Montenegro had to pay for the entry into NATO. And that was it. And there is no success in corruption fighting. And yes, I would really like to know, where do you see the instruments and the real and the possibility of a real success, which would be tremendously important for the large majority of people? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. How do you really tackle corruption, and where is the approach? Who would like to address this question? Perhaps, I don't know, Nikola, Jamie, Gordana.
Yeah. I thought, because when we were preparing for today's discussion, you also asked for some what the people think, public opinion surveys, etc.
That was going to be my next question.
I just want to illustrate, I did my homework and I double-checked all the latest, at least when it comes to my country.
And we do have, excuse me, we do have a question from the audience as well on this. So, but a written question. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So we talked about the 17 years in the waiting room. And if you think of it, once this door is opened, so the process is unlocked and we start the journey, accession process, this would have been a reason for nationwide celebrations for a month. But what we have is more pessimism. Let's say the number of people who think that we can make this in 5 years, join the EU in 5 years, dropped from 40% in 21 to 12%. This was done in January this year, so it's a very, very fresh. So only 12 in 100 Macedonian citizens think that we're going to make it in 5 years. Then about 65% of them think that the EU is unfair and arrogant. And the number EU membership is a good thing for us dropped from 70% 1 year ago to 49% this year. So the way we have the game is played today, it is really difficult for political forces to win on the EU ballot. They cannot deliver, and people don't trust them. And I think this is a problem. And very briefly on what you asked actually on corruption. To me, I think corruption and its form, partization or party political cronyism, I think those are probably the biggest problems that we have. And you know, I sometimes see, I was an accidental politician. I don't have a party, I was an activist. And maybe it's easier for me to say this, but many of the political parties in the region act as if they are employment agencies. So they give jobs and they give privileges to their clients, that is their members or their supporters. So we have to push back as societies, the political parties where they belong, which is policies, right? Visions, fiscal policy, foreign policy, but we have to stop political parties' influence in schools or hospitals or public companies. This is what we have to do. And fighting corruption and providing accountability for high-level officials, partization is also a big obstacle because public prosecutors and judges feel that they need party backing. They will need it for their children, perhaps. So, and I think we have to be very bold here. You know, you cannot be pro-European and at the same time have these issues. We have to have more meritocracy. And the big reason why the young people are leaving, I met 17 of them in Olbach in Austria, between 18 and 23. All of them said, what is the first problem in your mind with our country, North Macedonia? They said partization. Too much of political parties in our daily life. So for them to have equal opportunities is a must. Otherwise, it's easier for them to go and find a job in Germany. And some of them are doing that. So I think this is, and we need help on this. You know, we need help from DG NEAR, member states, our American friends. We need a more strict policy on these fundamental issues. Because if we don't, then this discussion about the West and the East becomes a discussion about, you know, the sides of the world. Behind the West, we have a set of principles that we need to aspire to. And they need to be taken into account when Western leaders meet the leaders of the Balkans.
Could I just jump in, Marta?
Yes, please go ahead.
So just to pick up on Nikola's comment, I mean, I think he raised a couple of interesting points. The population flows you see obviously are having horrible consequences for their home countries, but it's positive in the sense that young people in these countries are obviously seeing their future as a European future. They're just deciding that their governments are not able to move through that process quick enough, so they're taking matters into their own hands, deciding to move to the EU or elsewhere on their own. The interesting thing I think we see from our audiences is a great interest still in what is going on inside the EU, what is happening in Brussels. One way that we're trying to help with this situation is to do more reporting about what actually is European policy, what's happening in member state capitals, making sure that we have more journalists to cover events in the European institutions, which I think is important because we do see in all of the countries we're operating in significant efforts by corrupted media, sometimes linked to Russia, sometimes to other political actors who are going out of their way to tear down the EU, to tear down EU policies. That is a clear theme of a lot of the disinformation we see in the Western Balkans. And so I think the more that the EU can do work to get its own message out to the public, even if there's not an immediate compelling narrative about how quickly EU accession or some of the benefits of joining the European community is going to happen, I think that is important to make sure people actually understand what European policy is towards the region. And then the other point I just again highlight, I mentioned before, investigative journalism. It is so essential to undermining corruption. It's very difficult to do. You can't just have small independent outlets in many cases that can churn out investigative reports that are highly impactful. It's hard to do well. It requires a lot of people. It requires training for your journalists. It requires security, legal advice. In many of these countries, if you do serious investigative work, it can lead to you becoming targeted by corrupt actors or shut down by corrupted governments. And so the more resources that can be devoted by EU member state aid agencies, as well as by the US, to supporting investigative journalism, I'd say the better in terms of helping to push back against a lot of the deep ingrained corruption that we see in the region.
Thank you, Jamie. Gordana, please go ahead. I know you raised your hand as well.
No, it's fine. I mean, I just wanted to add to what both Nikola and Jamie have said. I think civil society in this region is basically fulfilling the role of what the state should be doing, and it has been happening for several decades now, right? Whether it is helping with people in need whose fundamental rights have been hurt, or whether it is with the reporting that Jamie has mentioned. So I really think that the role of the civil society is going to be crucial, and that is really a true partner to both US and the EU when it comes to dealing with and fighting corruption in the region. Now, one of the really big missing pieces in the region has been the work with the political parties, and in terms of political parties financing, it's an intransparent process, definitely. And the problem is also that many of the political parties in the region are in bed with the organized crime groups. And that is how these parties are financing themselves. And this is why we have this a vicious circle of corruptive activity. One more thing, which I believe that the EU should not allow itself to repeat, is turning the blind eye on certain processes that are being that the region is being tasked with to finish, so like rule of law and so on. Many times in the past, the EU would turn the blind eye so that something else gets done and so on. But if we really want this region to move forward, the rule of law is really it's a matter of life and death for the people in this region as well. So, and that is the only way to basically fight the state capture. And this is not something that should be negotiable between the EU and the countries in the Western Balkans. Plus, I think that this is one of the things that the citizens of the Western Balkans would appreciate, actually, of the EU. And that is also the way that the EU could mend its reputation in the EU. You see, I think that the majority of citizenry in the Balkans do not really think that the EU cares about them as people as well. So as long as they get whatever is needed from certain leaders in the region, but that's not really true. And I think we also have to show that that is not the truth. Insisting on the rule of law in the region, insisting on certain values, right, that we recognize as not just the European values, but the values of the entire Western civilization, is also something that is good for the people in the region. It will benefit for their everyday life. And I think we have to insist on that.
Thank you, Gordana. Insisting on the rule of law, I thought also that was part of the goals with the revised new methodology and the focus on the fundamentals and the good governance criteria. And this has been, I think, adopted, if I'm not mistaken, about 2 years ago. But I guess we haven't had the chance to still see the merits of this new methodology approach, because member states have blocked the progress of the dossiers in many instances. But I thought that was also the goal of this new methodology, this new approach to enlargement that sort of places the focus on the fundamentals and the rule of law issues. Perhaps you can also comment on the merits of this new approach. But also going back on the issue that you said, that civil society is fulfilling the role of the state, I want to bring just one last question to you on this, on the role of civil society and the polls that we've seen. According to this recent poll by the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, we know that 51% of Serbians think Russia is Serbia's closest foreign policy partner, 80% are against sanctions on Russia in Serbia, and less than half of the citizens would vote in favor of joining the EU. And my question to you is, to all of you, to the three of you, and I know, Nikola, you've already addressed a little bit of the public opinion polls in North Macedonia, but what can the EU and the US do, in your point of view, to revert this trend? And also, I mean, how worried are you about Russia's ability to destabilize the region and exploit this these ethnic tensions, particularly in Serbia and Bosnia? I don't know who. Perhaps Gordana, you want to answer, and then.
Again, an easy question. Well, I am worried about Russia exploiting, the current state of affairs for its whether short-term or long-term gain, of course. But I'm also worried in a long run. I see China as a really big threat in the region too, mainly by making region completely dependent on it via loans that it's making in the region and via its investments that it's making in the region. I'm sorry, your question was composed of many different questions. So one was the meddling basically of Russia and China and exploitment. What was the other?
No, the other one was just on this public opinion polls in Serbia that think that Russia is Serbia's closest partner. 51% of Serbians and 80% are against sanctions on Russia. And what can the EU and the US do to revert this trend, in your point of view?
Yeah, well, I would be very careful with certain polls. I do know that most of the polls show this, but having worked here for so many years and with the civil society, I would say that still the majority of people would actually be happy if Serbia joined the EU tomorrow, and that would be a solution to many of the problems. I think many of the problems in Serbia in particular are related to the 90s. I think there is a substantial misunderstanding of what actually took place and certain events over the 90s, and also living in denial of certain events that took place in the 90s. And as such, there is an emotional reaction to it. And I would say that actually Russia has gained most of its popularity after the 90s in Serbia, because most of the population in Serbia thinks that what happened and what took place in 1999 was wrong, and that because Serbia was, always on the good side of history in the previous wars in the 20th century, there is how should I say, lack of understanding of why what happened in the 99 actually happened. And I think, people are also entitled to agree or disagree with what took place in the 99. But I think what is also then misunderstood is what is really the trajectory for this region onward. So from 2000 onward. And with the lack of the EU's involvement or lack of actually offering a time frame for the rest of this region, for the Western Balkans 6, I think the majority of people really stop believing that the EU actually wants this region in the European Union, and that all of the reasons given to the region for it not happening at the speed that once we thought would be happening, that those were all just excuses for something that was never to happen for the region. So practically you will have also plenty of people in the region thinking that the Western Balkans is yet another Turkey, and that is what basically was the plan all along. And I think it's really important to make sure that the people in the Western Balkans understood that that's not the case, if it is not the case, right? And that is very important, because if that is understood, I think that people can find a little more patience, so to say, in them to work with this, especially if the process from now on is putting citizens in the center of that process and their well-being. And that's what I meant when I was mentioning the rule of law. But it's not just the rule of law. We all have to understand that there are certain, when I talked about civil society doing what states should be doing, it's not just that. There is, you know, the basic services of the state, such as education and healthcare, have become too expensive for many of the citizens, whether by a corruption or by complete negligence of these services. So people have to be asking those services in the private hands, right? So these are all forms that the organized crime groups and corruptive groups are using to hold citizenry hostage and to make them fear to be against the government that they are in bed with. So that's the point, or the political leadership that they are in bed with. That's the point. So we have to really work much more and much faster and much more prudently on separation of powers and on, showing who is who. Basically, we have to show, and we have to help the civil society report on who the corruptive groups are. And at the moment, they are the only ones doing that. Actually, what happened was good in the last 2 years in the region, and that was that the DEA, together with certain, parts of the police and other forces in the region, several tons of cocaine have been seized by this, and that was good because after all, this region is part of something which is called the Balkan route, and that's not insignificant. Plenty live off the business of the Balkan route, and we know about the organized crime and the connections with this with the South America, etc., etc. So all of these are playing role. The fight against corruption will be a long fight, but I think we have to be a lot more determined in the times that are ahead of us to basically deal with that. And, we have to start from somewhere.
Thank you. I wonder if Nikola and Jamie now want to also comment on Russia's role in the region and its ability to destabilize the region now.
Maybe I can go ahead. Simply to greet virtually both Gundur and Andre, who were kind enough to give us questions, are here with us. I hope I see them in person also soon. But I think Russia clearly has the role of a spoiler in our region. I think its interests are different because of our geographic distance, luckily, to those who are more in their neighborhood. But I think there is an advantage in our region failing, and then can use that narrative as a counter one in their areas, right? To disappoint others. That's why I think the analogy with the success of the region will play a big role in Ukraine in many ways, in the context of whether we have a successful European integration or not. Whenever, for instance, when we were negotiating the Prespa agreement, Greece expelled 2 diplomats. So there was obviously the Greek state found evidence of interference against against the attempt that was successful to solve a bilateral problem that was there for almost 3 decades. I think this modus operandi that we see in history of misusing or adding fuel to an existing dispute or grievance and the dispute and the region is full and rich, regrettably, with disputes. Some people have been talking about this whole story between on Macedonian Bulgarian friendship to partly be instigated with disinterest. You know, we are two NATO members, and if we can quarrel, and if Bulgaria can become from a champion into an obstacle for a European future, then maybe this is a good thing for them. So I think we have to be, I don't think this should be underestimated. It's probably also not helpful to overestimate. We have to remain vigilant. We have to be aware of this. And especially in the social media and in the media themselves, I think this is visible. So I was checking, I promised numbers in a poll that was done by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in November to the question, do you understand the motives of Russia behind the aggression of Ukraine? 55 said no, and 17 said yes, they understood the motives, which are, we can do better, but these numbers are not too, because maybe we're also especially sensitive on one European nation denying identity to another European nation. I think this narrative resonates because of our own national experience. But I don't think we are where we want to be also in the way we see the stakes of this war. That the whole order, the security order is under attack. Fundamental principles of the peace in the world after the Second World War. And this is done by one of the P5 in the UN. I don't think this is fully sort of acknowledged in the Macedonian public opinion.
Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, I agree with Nikola and Gordana on a number of points. I would just say, we talked a lot earlier about whether Brussels and Washington have a compelling narrative for the region. And I think the general assessment was we don't have a compelling narrative right now. And that's why Russia and increasingly China are able to make inroads. At Reader for Europe, Reader Liberty, we see this is Putin's playbook in pretty much every part of Eurasia. He tried it in Ukraine prior to the invasion. He's trying it right now in Moldova, places like Georgia. I was just in Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan last week. His narrative is forget about the West. They don't care about you. They won't ever deliver. Obviously promoting cultural, historical ties and trying to pull people closer to Russia ultimately and make the and advance the narrative that Brussels and Washington will only abandon you. And they'll talk a good game, but they'll never deliver results. They'll never actually provide the sort of economic support and the ties that people want. And so I think it's only because of the fact that Brussels and Washington are giving the Russians an opening that they're able to be so successful. And we see it in our engagement with our audience that the Russian narratives do have an impact. Now, I will say, I think if you look at how they actually get the message out, one thing we need to note is it's not just that their own propaganda outlets, Russia Today, Sputnik, are so amazingly effective in the region. Actually, quite to the contrary, they often don't have significant audiences. But in this region, where I have seen them make inroads is through their use of Serbian language media outlets. And that's partly because the Serbian media space is so corrupted already and is an information landscape with all kinds of political actors, some tied to the government, who are advancing their own agenda. But the Russians, very effectively piggyback on that Serbian media ecosystem, not just to get their messages to Serbian speakers inside Serbia, but also to get their messages to other countries in the region, other languages. And a lot of that Serbian coverage of the war, of Putin, of Russia, gets translated and bleeds over into the Albanian media market, as well as Macedonian. And it's through those inherent issues in the Serbian media landscape that Russia is able to advance its narrative throughout the region. And so I think it's worth focusing on that and finding ways then to push back and counter. Certainly you need strong independent media options in Serbian, but it perhaps should then become an issue for the bilateral conversations with the Serbian government as well, if these sorts of tactics are concerning enough to Washington and Brussels. And I think it's important to note how a lot of this disinformation gets into the ecosystem. The final thing I'll just say, one thing we continue to do to try to counter this, and we've had a decent amount of success, I think, and we find that audiences in the region want to know the facts about what's actually happening in Ukraine. They want to engage with content from Ukraine, stories about how the war is impacting the lives of ordinary Ukrainians. And so we have significantly increased our output of reports from the front lines, from Ukraine. And we're well positioned to do that because we have a large presence in Ukraine. And that's the sort of coverage which obviously any media that is pro-Moscow is not going to have, and is not, in most cases, is going to ignore and try to act like the war is barely happening. Or if they do want to engage in coverage of the war, it's going to be conspiracy theories about Zelensky and about supposed Nazis in Ukraine, things that are so outlandish that I think it's harder to get them to resonate with many audiences in the region.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and really very brave work that you do in the front lines and your team. I think indeed the clash of narratives is a critical issue, and we are going to have a session our next Transatlantic Challenges event is really going to discuss media freedom in the Balkans, in the Western Balkans. So it's going to be specifically devoted to this, because it's really a topic on its own that deserves a lot of time and attention. So, but I do want to thank you all, because I think you really are on the ground making sure that the right narratives prevail, and that's very important work. And I'm very, very grateful. We are very grateful for your insights and your participation in this discussion today, and also many thanks to our audience for staying with us. I wish you a wonderful rest of the afternoon. We will continue to closely monitor these topics, and we look forward to welcoming you all in our future events. And thank you very much once again to our speakers for your very candid statements and opinions, and have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.